So hello everyone, welcome to the 5th DIY Cultures. We've been going now for 5 years, me, Sophie and Helen. This year we've got a communal table, we've got new commissions, and we have a live webcast, live streaming TV station outside too. The very first panel is called Theresa May and the Others. Theresa May is someone who's nearly ruined my life, my family's life, as Home Secretary, and in many ways, her term in the Home Office inspired DIY cultures to stand up and build new activist communities. To start us off, we're going to start with one of my favourite zines of all time, which is British Values, a much derided phrase these days. So welcome Kieran from British Values.
Thank you. So one of the reasons I'm here kind of on this panel is to really contextualise the rhetoric of British values over contemporary culture and politics over the last 10 years, really, but most aggressively its use in politics and political rhetoric in the last 5 years by David Cameron and Theresa May as Home Secretary, and now is really being pushed home as she is Prime Minister. So it's a little bit of kind of context for those of you who don't know. The term was really used during Tony Blair's ascension to power as a way of talking to multicultural ideas of inclusion during his kind of rule Britannia time. So when he talked about British values, it was very much about, you know, this is a great new Labour multicultural era where we're going to talk about what it is to be British. And there was sort of, you know, it became like, you know, something that was spoken about in hushed whispers as an us and them fighting extremism term, but that didn't really ramp up until Theresa May was using it across the campaign trail in 2010 and beyond. So my zine really looks at that. It looks at what's happened in that time, how the rhetoric has created a real us and them narrative between white British patriots and everybody else who is left out of that conversation. So British Values as a zine really looks at detention and deportation as its central themes, the history of empire, and the way that political rhetoric that happens in Parliament then sort of brings itself and falls into grassroots cultural conversations. So I don't have I actually have a stall over there if you guys want to have a look later, but I'm just going to kind of go through some of the things as a cultural response to really frame what I'm talking about. So my day job is as a journalist. So we're having conversations about education, the NHS, Home Office legislation, things that have been happening over the last year. But for me, like doing a zine, probably quite different to other panelists, was a more irreverent cultural take on what was happening, to speak to young people across Britain, but particularly from immigrant communities, to really frame and talk about what that phrase meant to them, and like Hamja was saying, you know, how it feels particularly aggressive or poisonous. Okay, so just to have a really quick go through. One of them is a sort of look at Churchill as a famed person of heritage in the UK, despite his very kind of racist and famine-led policies. This is a kind of aping of a great British institution, page 3, with Sadiq Khan, and kind of at this time it was sort of looking at Pokemon Go as a look at Theresa May's then Home Office vans that she was sort of collecting people that didn't have the right papers and then deporting. This is a look at lunch boxes to kind of disseminate the idea of what is and isn't acceptable in classrooms and the institution of school in terms of food and being in vogue and looking at pop-up culture culturally. And this, for example, speaks to the statistic last year that 44% of British people thought that empire was a good thing. So this whole idea of kind of looking at, you know, the sort of wanking over stolen colonial treasures that now sit in the British Museum that belong to other countries is a really fixed and damaging way where the kind of cultural consciousness of empire, of praising empire and its ruin, has really happened and is being taught in schools and kind of in wider cultural conversations. So there's lots more of that kind of stuff in that. But to me, it was really important to really disseminate what detention and deportation really means on a grassroots level. So the Home Office loopholes this year, which has really seen spousal visas and marriage legislation, deport, I think the last count was 2,500 British citizens in 2017. So that's this year alone, people who have British citizenship who have then fallen victim to the loopholes of the Home Office because they don't earn the 18,600 minimal requirement and have then been sent home. So it's also this idea as kind of activist communities to really unpick what British citizenship means and to debunk the idea that this is the golden ticket that will keep you safe. So for immigrant families like mine who have come to this country to try and obtain British citizenship, which will stay with you and sort of make you British, actually that is a great lie of our generation and a great lie of our contemporary society, because UK citizenship can be stripped. It has been stripped. We're seeing this constantly. And one of the most effective ways that it's done is because it really poses an us and them culture. So Britishness is something that you can only try on if you are non-white. If you're born here and you're white British, you are not accused of not having British values. So even in the way that we talk about the white working class and its demonisation over the last 10 years, which Owen Jones obviously writes really effectively about, the shirker rhetoric that has demonised white working class communities has never been an accusation that they are not British, in a way that immigrant communities are not British if they are claiming or they are engaged in criminal activity, or even if they are living in tenement buildings, for example. So for me, British values as a rhetoric is a tool which our government is using very effectively via the Prevent strategy in education, via the demonisation of nurses and doctors and immigrant communities in the NHS, very aggressively in our Home Office legislation in detention and deportation. Yarlswood and Sisters Uncut and lots of activist groups around that are doing excellent work to really flag up that issue. And also the Anti-Raids Network, if you're not already familiar with, who really are talking about immigration raids and what we can do as a community of activists to make sure that we are on the front line of protecting people who are being deported, but also quite aggressively raided via UKBA and immigration officers. So yeah, that is me. It's a little bit of a framework to kind of give you a sense of what we're talking about culturally, politically, and as activists, what we can do. We'll be talking about this kind of stuff all day. But yeah, I'm going to leave it to you guys to really talk about some of those things in a little bit more detail. Thank you.
One of the most pernicious films of legislation introduced by Theresa May was the family, what's it called?
The family immigration rules with the income threshold, which you mentioned. And I guess I'm up next.
We're going to, this next project I'm going to introduce called Love Letters to the Home Office, which is a theatrical a project which resists this form of legislation. Okay. Where's your?
It's here, which I think is open.
Okay.
Can we get it up on that screen? Here we are. And I actually put together kind of a little presentation to kind of give some context on the rules, if you don't know about the rules, but about the project where we started, where we've gone over the last several years. Because for us, it's a very personal project. So Love Letters to the Home Office is the name of the project. It's a book, it's a play, it's a group of artists working together to sort of raise awareness about the 2012 family immigration rules. And we're not bashing on the government. We're not necessarily calling out Theresa May specifically, except, well, we know it's her rule, but what we want to do is show support for the people who are affected by it. The law, if you don't know, sets an artificially high financial requirement. It means people in the UK who earn less than £18,600 per year have different human rights to the rest of the UK population. They don't have the right to live with their wives or their husbands or their partners or their families if those families are overseas and outside the EU. Article 8 of the European Convention on Human Rights guarantees a right to family life. So while the law is still in place, there's thousands of families who are separated. They're unable to live together. And we as a collective of artists are documenting the truly extraordinary love stories of these separated families. And we're telling the stories of love. It crosses borders, it crosses seas. First off, who am I? Right? My name's Jason. I was born in the US, you might be able to tell. I came to the UK from Seattle in 2006, mostly for the adventure of living in Europe, but there was a visa available to me at the time, which is a highly skilled migrant, so I could come over, I could find work, it was great. All of my background and training is in theater, in lighting design. I have long been involved in local activism in Seattle, and once I became a British citizen, I was able to start getting involved here as well. And I'm a co-founder of this project. I produced the play, I helped publish the book. So a little context, we go back to the 9th of July 2012. Theresa May has passed this law. This is the text of a speech to Parliament that she gave. The argument for this whole law is that she wants, it's setting the minimum income level to protect the taxpayer, was the argument, making sure that immigrants can pay their own way, right? It ignores the fact that immigrants from outside the EU are not actually eligible to claim public benefits. The visa that I had coming over, it said on it, flat out, no recourse to public funds. People can't just come over here, go on unemployment, collect money. It doesn't work that way. So it's a false argument to start with. Like, there's the visa, it says so right there. I'm gonna put some context on that number of £18,600. So first off, that's for just one partner. If you've got a child, it goes up to £22,500. Every child after that is £2,400 more that you have to earn per year in order to get a family visa. So, as of last month, the national minimum wage is $7.50 an hour. If you do the math here, so assume a 40-hour work week for 52 weeks a year. So that's ignoring any public holidays, taking time off for yourself, right? Do that math. It's not $18,600. That's before tax, even. It's never mind that the national, working week is 37.5 hours. All of that. You wouldn't get in. You wouldn't be able to bring your family over. And according to studies from Oxford University, that would flat out disqualify almost half of the entire UK population. Nearly half the UK population doesn't make enough money to do that. The numbers go up in different parts of the country. It's more in Scotland, it's more in Wales. 29% of people working in employment in London don't make this income cap. And 61% of women don't make enough money to bring their partners or their family over. There's no accommodation in the law for students, for pensioners, for the disabled, or for your partner's ability to earn when they come over. It's all on you. So that's the context. This whole project started basically over a cup of bubble tea. I have a friend who is also a lighting designer. She had been dating a man from Montenegro for several years. They finally got married. And it took them 18 months. It took them 3 tries to be granted a visa to come over because she's an artist, she's freelance. She doesn't make enough money. It has nothing to do, again, with his skills,
his knowledge, his ability, her ability. It's all about how much can she make in a year. So what we wanted to do was not just tell her story, but raise awareness for everyone. There's tens of thousands of families who are affected by this. We wanted to unite those families. We wanted to give them a platform to tell their stories. We wanted to draw attention to the law. We wanted to show support for the Home Office because they're just doing what the government wants them to do. The people who are making the decisions on these visas, they're not lawyers. You only need 2 GCSEs to get a job in the Home Office to do this. Part of our goal is to really help demonstrate that it's the Home Office that needs help. These people need training, they need budget, they need learning in order to do this right. And they're not being given that either. And we wanted to raise this awareness through literature and activism and theater and art. So we started with a tweet, we got online. We reached out to people, we found communities that already existed. There's a great website called Great Sits, which has been fighting a very similar cause. And we collected stories. We rallied friends together. We used some ghostwriters to help people sort of tell the stories better and make them readable. We got involved online, Twitter, Facebook, website, all of that as you do. All of the stories are online, by the way, because we wanted to make them accessible. We did publish a book, which is now, it's something that is an emblem. Here it is. It's a physical thing which exists, which tells people who are in this book and tells people who are in this situation that they are important. And it's got an ISBN number, which means it's in the British Library. This is an artifact that will be in the British Library for all time. The law will change, the government will go away, things will be different. This will document that it was like this, and that was exciting to us as well. So, fast forward, that was in 2014. Sort of get through the book, we get some publicity around it, that was great. And we come to the end of the year and we're thinking, well, how do we keep this alive? Where do we go from here? What do we do next? And of course, we all sort of realize that we're theater makers and we tell stories. So we put the stories on stage. The Battersea Arts Center, just before the 2015 election, did a whole festival of shows called Taking a Stand. This was their festival. It was all about people sort of standing up for something. So we were able to, through connections that we had, get in on this and turn this into, it was a simple
setup for the evening, but we were able to get people up on stage reading the stories, taking other people's voices and bringing them to life, bringing them to a much wider audience in one session. 4 performers around a table, surrounded by bits of stories. We were mixing quotes, stories from the book, there were facts, figures, commentary. We engaged other artists, so we had original music, we had spoken word, sort of in response to this. And we put a voice to the stories in a way that had a much bigger reach than the book. And it's not the best picture, but we sold out 2 nights at Battersea Arts Center, which was really, really exciting. Off the back of that, because we were up there anyway, we ended up organizing a one-off reading at the Edinburgh Fringe Festival in August. We gathered together people that we knew who were there already. We got them around a table, and we did it again. And it was, again, very successful. And last year, we did it again in Leeds. Again, someone was doing a show, there were people available. We wanted to sort of take the opportunity to raise some awareness. For all 3 shows, we did live broadcasts on Skype and on Periscope so that we could reach out to the people who were not able to be there. There could be people in London, there were people in America and Australia and Egypt, the family members who could not be here to be a part of this in person. We were able to reach out to them online. One of the things we learned in Leeds and in Edinburgh was that it doesn't have to be a big, full production to be a valuable thing. It's 4 people around a table with a script. the value is in telling the stories and helping people understand the impacts of the policy and to get the word out, which means we're able to do it kind of anywhere, anytime if we want. It's a living document, of course, because the rules keep changing, or the law is changing, the situation is changing. Theresa May is now the Prime Minister. You know, there's things that will need to change, but we can do it anywhere. We've also been active in other ways. Several MPs got a copy of the book based off the back of a fundraiser that we did. We started a campaign online to just send messages to David Cameron at the time. Send a white feather and a list of names of people that you know who are affected by this. And there were several hundred messages, I think, that ended up going to Downing Street, just to sort of raise this awareness and let them know that these are real people being affected by real laws. And we've been marching. We're a voice online. The law still stands. Elections are coming, so we're being more active again. And the media is paying attention. You'll see headlines. There's a brand new series that's just started on Channel 5 that's actively telling these stories about how the law is tearing families apart. And we're still here, and there's lots of other groups, and we're still caring and still wanting to tell the stories. That's me.
Thank you to Love Letters to the Home Office. So we've just talked about families being separated by Theresa May. So I'm just going to talk about now how Theresa May separated my family, which will lead on to May. So it was 5 years ago that the whole DIY culture's community grows out of the campaign I had for my brother at the time. So 5 years ago to this day, I was on this stage and I was trying to save my brother, who had already been detained without trial or charge for over 6 years under an extradition request from the United States, a country he had never actually been to, for marginal association with a website. Theresa May was the one who signed his extradition request and boasted, "Wasn't it great to say goodbye," at the Conservative Party conference that year. And didn't even refer to him by his name. They call him the Others, as the Daily Mail did. And hence this event is called Theresa May and the Others. So Theresa May's gone on to affect other families, and we've gone from treating British citizens unequally to actually stripping citizenship. May Ayres, who's sitting here, has actually done a life-size sculpture of Theresa May, which you can find on the mezzanine, and it's sort of like a tribute to the whole campaign and Talha and that struggle. So next up is May Ayres.
I don't know how to work this either. You probably remember the 2003 invasion of Iraq and the huge demonstration that happened here. Perhaps a lot of you were probably too young. I mean, it was 14 years ago now. And millions of us marched in London and throughout the world. On reflection, we probably did it all wrong. We went home at the end of the day. I think if everyone sat down and refused to move, they couldn't have shifted millions of us. But the invasion went on. Shock and awe happened, which was sickening to see on the media, presented as a huge firework display. And I started making sculptures really about this phony war on terror, this war of aggression. I don't quite know how to start to do this. I started off with, what do I do? I started off with John Negroponte, who was the US ambassador in Baghdad in 2004. His early incarnation was as US ambassador in Honduras during the time when the Contras, a US-backed terror group, were fighting Sandinistas in Nicaragua. Death squads, human rights abuses were going on under Negroponte's nose. And it's the same old imperial ambitions that were on display again. And so I made a sculpture of Negroponte, some of his victims. You know, after all the carnage that was going on, you got trickles of individual people who've been swept up and destroyed through this aggression. And on this, I don't know how to get to it, but you'll probably come up again. On Negroponte's column, there are some of his victims, like Margaret Ahsan, who was brutally murdered. Still don't know who actually did it. But it led me on to hearing about other individual stories. I mean, in the UK, there was Mozambique, Binyam Mohammed, Shaka Amar, all swept up, all being in the wrong place at the wrong time. And then I began hearing about the incarceration of Baba Ahmad, and particularly Tala Ahsan. And it was due to Hamja's fantastic campaign that actually got out to everyone. You know, I mean, no one would have known about it, about Tala Ahsan, you know, this gentle poet, being imprisoned for no crime except going onto a website. It was deemed to be a terrorist by the US. And it was Theresa May as a Home Secretary that was so blatantly vicious and you know, determined to carry out the US's bidding to extradite Tala together with Baba and the others. And so I thought, you know, I've got to do something about this. You know, I've got to work out my anger by making this column. So I started to make the column of Tala, who is really displayed as a dove, and Theresa May as the crow. I mean, I found this incredible photo on the internet of a crow actually flying onto a dove in mid-air, and it seemed to sum up what Theresa May was doing. And they were shown in the Belfry last October. At the same time, I mean, I've been working on this series now for 13 years. I wasn't expecting to, but as you know, the carnage has escalated. The same pattern is happening now in Syria. It's already happened in Libya. The same lies, the same excuses, the same propaganda is being pumped out. People, and I'm, you know, it is so easy to forget. You know, everything goes down the memory hole. We had to be so vigilant, but I just couldn't stop trying to say. The more I heard about individual stories, I just wanted to try and give some of these people a voice. So yeah, that's what I've been doing for the last 13 years, is making this series of sculptures about the war of aggression, or the war of aggression. The British values one that I'd started making a sculpture of a bomb-damaged child, and at the same time the papers were full of Theresa May's British values, and I thought, you know, great. No, I have British values. What is it? Sort of double standards, hypocrisy, and so I was thinking about the celebrity culture. You know, how our British values seem to be being overtaken by celebrity culture. And I had a picture of the best dressed man of 2014, him and his wife next to the bomb damaged child. She's just looking at them. I also included a couple of teenagers. I'm not saying that all teenagers are apathetic and don't know what on earth is going on, but there's this. They have this incredible job of fighting through celebrity culture. It's been a way of trying to work through anger, I guess. I wasn't, as I say, I wasn't expecting to spend 13 years doing it, but it's relentless. And You know, I don't know. I guess I just want to try and keep the memory of what's happened in our recent past and how, you know, the whole thing is just going on and on and on. And people's lives are being ruined by this incredible, whatever, I'm lost for words. Okay, that's it. Thank you.
Thank you. May's sculpture is actually on the mezzanine, and you can go and see it. Theresa May doesn't make much public appearances, but she made one for our festival. She
A couple of booklets of all the War of Aggression series that I did. There's a later one of 2016, and there's an earlier one, 2011, the first part of my War of Aggression series, if anyone's interested.
Okay, thank you. You can meet May after if you want to talk to her, and she'll be around her sculpture. So we've talked a lot about solidarity, and we talked about memorising injustices, and we've talked about earlier periods of history. To me, there are going to be many state crimes by Theresa May, and there have been many already. But to me, the one campaign that we can all learn from is the Hillsborough Justice Campaign. So I've got Kevin Sampson here, who's come all the way from Liverpool and has been instrumental in making the film about fanzines in Hillsborough, which you can view in the gallery downstairs and will be open to 11. I think Kevin's just going to speak from his seat, or unless you want to stand up. And so, Kevin Sampson.
So in the run-up to this event, Hamja reminded me that previous interview I'd given quite a few years ago, I'd announced the demise of fanzine culture. So it just shows how much I know, just looking around all this, you know, the buzz around the place is fantastic. And even just, I went through into the cafe just half an hour ago, and there was a couple of women there who were, you know, physically trimming and finishing the fanzines. And I think the thing that I was driving at when I was talking about the, you know, the possible kind of demise of that culture was that the world seemed to be becoming more and more digitized. Jason was talking about his, you know, doing actually live broadcasting his plays via things like Periscope and Instagram and so on. So I just find it really gratifying actually that things like vinyl records and things like fanzines that you actually feel, and something that May said really touched a chord with me when she said, you know, I had to do something. And this takes us all the way back to even just to give some context of the political period leading up to the Hillsborough disaster. I mean, I think of May 1979 as being the moment that the country changed, you know, in a way that it's never really properly recovered from. Maybe when we get into the group discussion later on, I can go into some more detail about that. But to just give a little bit of context, May 79 was when Margaret Thatcher became the UK's first female Prime Minister. And one of the first things she did, and again I only found out about this through fanzines that were around at the time, was she actually not just increased the police's pay, but she gave them a 40% pay rise across the board. And that's almost as she's saying, listen, things are going to change in this country. And I don't want to particularly just personify it as a Thatcher thing, you know, her cabinet, you know, her government was made up of some just outstandingly evil individuals who promoted a form of government that was adversarial. You can see the echoes of it today. It's a thing, it is this us and them culture. And there was, you know, there's an immediate demonization of unions. The right to strike was something that we saw as an absolute tenet of our, you know, independence and our system. And the whole thing of riot police, you know, the SPG and so on, turning up on picket lines became, I remember going to steel workers strike in Sheffield, January 1980, and for the first time seeing truncheons drawn. I just had no experience of anything like that before. And being a football fan, that was, you know, the narrative that you were seeing in the mainstream media was that, you know, football fans were mindless, were aggressive, were extremely right-wing. That certainly wasn't my experience of it, but there was, there was a running kind of an understanding that if you just even remotely stepped out of line with the police, you could expect to be hit with a baton. That was the recurring thing you'd hear was, well, if you behave like animals, you can expect to be treated like animals, and we were. And the conditions under which we were expected to experience football were just, I mean, it's actually miraculous that something like Hillsborough hadn't happened many, many times prior to that. That particular ground was a death trap, and what happened in the immediate aftermath was a terrifying agenda to blame the victims, to blame the people who died for their own deaths. Effectively, what they were saying was that if it was a plane crash, they were blaming the passengers. So specifically about zines, I mean, I came from an area just about 5 miles out of Liverpool, quite a quiet suburb. If you're thinking in terms of the kind of housing, it was that generation of working class parents who bought their first house. So we were by no means on the breadline. Everything. It was Formica and lino. The house was brand new, and how you kind of plugged into culture was very, very specific. Really, you have to try and imagine a world prior to social media and prior to instantly attainable downloads and everything. So it was, it was the record shop. We had a great bookshop, which is still there, called News from Nowhere, and Probe Records were places where you could pick up zines of different sorts. There were political ones, there were ones that were specifically about football, ones that were more about music. But those were the things that really opened my eyes to just getting in touch with other people who thought like I did and were interested in the things that I was interested in. So, for example, like the very first CND march that I ever went on, I became aware of through a magazine in News from Nowhere. There's a little advert in the back, and you could pay for your coach ticket from there. And similarly, things like going through like that period of being unemployed in the early 80s, there was a magazine that was established called The End, and that really spoke to me very directly about my own experiences of starting to feel alienated and disenfranchised, and wondering whether, I mean, God knows what it's like if you're a teenager now trying to get yourself going, if that's the minimum wage there. But it was this thing of putting you in touch with a community and building a community and building groups of people that you knew that you could rely upon in certain situations. The End ran for many, many years, and at the time that the Hillsborough disaster happened, as I'm sure everybody's very well aware, the narrative went out almost instantaneously that the deaths had been caused by fan disorder, fan misbehaviour, this complete and utter fallacy about the gates being kicked in when that would have been physically impossible to do that. And the right-wing media was right on it and collaborated in it right from the word go. And there was very little in the way of resistance, even from the sorts of media that you might have relied upon in those days, like the left-leaning Guardian and the Observer and places like that, weren't really that interested. There wasn't a great deal of resistance except on a local level. And it was really the zines. I mean, the only actual national publication I can remember getting right behind the campaigns and our efforts to actually get the truth out there was a magazine called When Saturday Comes. There was local zines like What's the Score, Red All Over the Land, that were more specifically football and football culture zines that did big pieces. But in terms of the Hillsborough Justice campaign getting going, those were really, they were actually pivotal in getting the word out there. Because, again, coming back to May's comment about wanting to do something, there comes a point where you just can't just sit there and allow these calumnies to go on unchallenged. And even if it's, I mean, God, there was some terrible poems that came out of the zines, but people had to, everybody felt that they had to say something and do something and try and get together. And I know that Sheila spoke here with Becky Shah last year, and one of the tools that they used to get the initiatives out to the people who could immediately help, such as the boycott of Hillsborough, the fundraising gigs that we did, leaflet campaigns, going right through to the 2006 Truth Day, where you actually had the entire ground standing up for 6 minutes, holding up placards saying justice for the 96. I've got an indelible image of Thierry Henry actually just stopping in the middle of the pitch. So it was Liverpool against Arsenal in the FA Cup. Fittingly, it was being broadcast live by Murdoch's Sky Television, and we actually used them. We subverted their media to get the message across. And it was one of the things really that had an impact in just keeping the campaign alive. You know, as with any ongoing campaign, there are times when you just feel that you're getting nowhere and you've run out of options. But someone will always come up with something. Somebody would come up with an idea. Again, we used the zines to get it out there and take the whole thing wider. So that I've skimmed and praised, but that really is the primary way in which we've tapped into zine culture in starting to and continuing to and getting the message out to a point now where I do think that there's a long way still to go, because we effectively were coming from, we'd had 25 years of lies really before the Hillsborough Independent Panel report gave its findings. So there's now, gradually an understanding that our truth is the actual truth, and books like Hillsborough Voices, which is the graphic that you see there, that's a collection of accounts from people who were most directly involved in the disaster itself, families, relatives, survivors, and the people who've been involved in the campaigns as well. I've made it my business to make sure that it gets into libraries in particular, as many libraries as possible, so that people can actually access it. I completely concur with what you were saying, Jason, about leaving a legacy, something that's physical, that will always be there for people to reference, and find out what actually happened and the lengths that the government and the establishment went to cover up the truth. Thank you very much.
And lastly, we're going to have Nisha Kapoor, who's one of the best academics writing about the state and race and how they intersect and the various injustices. Nisha's got a new book coming out by Verso called Deport, Deprive, Extradite, and 21st century state extremism, and has written brilliantly on state crimes. Okay, so thank you, Nisha.
Can I sit here? Thanks for the invitation. This is an incredible event, and it's as has been said before, it's really great to see so many people here, and the incredible work that Hamja's done to sort of raise awareness around Theresa May, around the state, around all the different ways in which marginalised communities are being policed. The project I work on is called Deport, Deprive, Extradite, and it began, the intention was really, of the project, was a way to think about state racism, and it was intended to think about state racism through an exploration of the growing scope for expulsion in various different forms, particularly targeting marginalised communities, racialized communities. So, as the title suggests, the project has been documenting extradition cases, deportation cases, citizenship deprivation cases in the context of the war on terror that are legitimated through the context of the war on terror. It began through the work that I was doing with Hamja around campaigning for the justice of Ahsan. It began by documenting, with a sort of documentation of extradition cases, people, individuals who were being indicted by the US for terrorism-related offences and being requested for transfer from Britain to the US between 2000, the first case actually begins in 98, between that time and 2015. But in 2003, the extradition legislation, the legislation between the treaty between Britain and the US changes, and it allows the US to request an individual from the UK to the US without providing any prima facie evidence. And so the basis on which people are being indicted, the threshold was incredibly minimal. Ahsan was one of those cases. But what these extradition cases sort of allow, or sort of are really important for in a kind of broader contextual sense, is that they indicate or that they encompass some of the most extreme forms of state power. So they involve deportation, they involve incarceration and solitary confinement for long periods of time. In some cases, they involve citizenship deprivation. And there were only 9 cases, or only 9 individuals who were extradited from Britain to the US over this period. But they have been amongst some of the most high-profile cases. And so these are only a small proportion of the total number of people who are being incarcerated. If we think about the asylum system, if we think about the growing prison system, there are only a small number of people who are being deported. Again, when we think about mass deportations that are being legitimated in recent regimes. But they form some of the most high-profile in terms of the media, and they just allow a way in to thinking about what the state is doing at this time, and what's being sort of legitimated in terms of the law, in terms of what's happening in terms of the erosion of democracy, what's happening in terms of the expansion, the retraction of human rights, and then what citizenship means more broadly. So there's tons to sort of think about in terms of the way the policing system operates, in terms of the way in which these cases are used to legitimate the move away, for example, from the protections, if always kind of precarious or never fully realized of human rights. But there is a bigger issue, and I think the issue, just for the sake of time, that I'll just say a little bit about, is around kind of what's happening around citizenship. So as been mentioned by some of the other speakers, between in the post 9/11 context, the Sun newspaper starts a media campaign to deport, calling for the deportation of Abu Hamza. It was labeled as one of the extremists, one of the Islamic extremists that was present in Britain and regarded as sort of the domestic version of Osama bin Laden. And what the newspaper points out is that, unlike many of the other people who were being policed, who were being rounded up for deportation at the time, he was a British citizen. And it calls for a mass sort of mobilization of the public to lobby the British government for the deportation of Abu Hamza, and so that would entail the stripping of his citizenship. Why there wasn't any kind of measure in place to deprive British citizens of citizenship was something that was of increasing public concern. So David Blunkett, as a result of these newspaper campaigns, receives a raft of letters from the public demanding for Abu Hamza's the deprivation of his citizenship. On the back of that, a piece of legislation is passed in 2002, which paves the way for the deprivation of British citizenship on much wider terms than had ever been allowed for before. And it's informally referred to as the Hamza Amendment because it's on the back of him that the legislation is passed. Over the course of time, in 2006, further legislation is passed, which expands again the scope via which people can be deprived of their citizenship. And in 2014, on the back of another high terrorism case, Halal al-Jadda, who had been stripped of his citizenship after he'd been detained illegally or extra-legally for 3 years in Iraq in a detention center under British authorities. His case is used as kind of rhetoric by Theresa May and by other politicians and sort of talked about in the media for justifying further expansive powers of the citizenship deprivation legislation, which means that you can now make somebody stateless if it's believed they can get citizenship elsewhere. So the way in which this operates is to legitimize this stuff through the most, through sort of figures which don't win much popular appeal, which are presented as sort of high-profile terrorism suspects, and so most people, to gain kind of popular support for these measures. But obviously, the sort of impact beyond the sort of injustices that happen within these individual cases, the impact is to alter the broader scope of then what the state is allowed to do in terms of how it's managing its populations. So, as well as being able to deprive citizenship, the state's also introduced a number of informal measures via which it can alter the citizenship status of individuals, not formally through the deprivation of their citizenship, but informally through taking their passports away, or through temporary temporary exclusions and removals. Some of this hasn't been enacted very much in practice yet because it hasn't quite worked out how this is possible. But passport removals in 2013, extra royal prerogative powers were passed, which allows, which again sort of updated the measures via which the Home Secretary can remove somebody's passport. So this isn't a measure that's taken through the courts. It's a measure that's decided by the executive power. It's a measure that's approved by the Home Secretary. There's only been a small number of these, about 50, about kind of 30 to 50 people. The figures are quite hard. The official figures are quite hard to accurately ascertain. But there's been about, say, 50 people between 2013 and now who've had their passports removed on the grounds that they are deemed to be Islamic extremists. And the basis of much of this is around suspicion of wanting to travel to Syria. So as part of this project, we have been speaking to a number of individuals who have had their passports taken. Let me just... What happens in these cases is that they receive a letter from the Home Office telling them that, like citizenship, a passport is a privilege, not a right. It's assessed, and it usually says something like this in the letter. It's assessed that you are an Islamic extremist, that you are considered a person whose past, present, or proposed activities, actual or suspected, are so undesirable that the grant or continued enjoyment of passport facilities is believed to be contrary to the public interest. We know that these racialized practices, these kind of preemptive policing practices, are sort of scattered through the criminal justice system, through the policing system in various ways, in terms of policing of gangs and so on. And this has kind of offered another way, another route by which this is done. But of course the consequences are grave because the access to a passport isn't just about restricting people's freedom of travel. It does that, and that's significant. It also means that your access to all kinds of social and public services is restricted. So it means that you're limited in terms of your ability to work. It means that you're limited in terms of your denied access to university. It means that sometimes your bank account shut down. It means that you can't rent a house. It means that you can't learn to drive. It means that all kinds of ways of functioning are restricted. And so it creates this other category of citizen, another kind of way of removing or marginalizing certain groups of people, and done so, and it's legitimated through the criminalization of these subjects. In reality, the suspicion is from the individuals who we've spoken to. Their stories tell us the suspicion is based on all kinds of very low threshold activities. So it can be that, so they've never been charged with a criminal offence. That's really important. It can be that in the past that they travelled on an aid convoy to Syria. It might be that they've been late to the airport when they're about to travel. It might be that they've had encryption software on a USB stick. It might be that they're associated or know somebody else who's deemed to be suspicious. It might be that they're married to somebody who's deemed to be suspicious. A number of these cases, and consistently in many of these cases, they report that they have been asked to work for MI5 or the intelligence services and have refused. And when they refuse, the MI5 security services say to them, we can help you, or we can make things difficult, and if you work with us, we can grant you citizenship. If you work with us, we can, provide your passport that's been removed. And if you refuse, we'll make things difficult. And human rights lawyers that we've spoken to, or lawyers working these cases, consistently report this too. And certainly that comes through in most of, or many of the cases that we have, that we've spoken to. So, but at the same time as the passport removed stuff's happening, there's also a refusal to naturalize citizens. So people who have permanent residency, speaks to again some of the things that have been said by other people on the stage, that the number of people who, do you want me to shut up? Oh, okay. The number of people who are being refused citizenship, who are being the number of people who are being denied citizenship who have permanent residency here is also an issue, in the sense that the biggest reason why people are being refused citizenship now is on the grounds of bad character. So, I have some numbers, hang on. Since the mid-2000s, the number of people being refused naturalized citizenship on the grounds of bad character has gradually increased, so that after a small dip in 2014, in 2015, 42% of people who refused citizenship were refused on those grounds. It's consequently becoming the principal reason why citizenship is refused. Since this is a subjective measure and not officially defined in law, there's some flexibility in its application and it's open to wide interpretation. There's no official legal definition of what constitutes bad character, but in policy terms it incorporates not abiding by or respecting the law, being associated with war crimes, not having one's financial affairs in appropriate order, being involved in notorious activities that cast serious doubt on standing in the local community, being dishonest with the UK government, assisting in the evasion of immigration control, or having previously been deprived of citizenship elsewhere. Terms are kept sufficiently vague so that a decision maker can still refuse citizenship, even if, outside of that list. While the framework for demarcating citizens and granting citizenship has always been deeply racialized, the supplementation of these kind of objective thresholds for citizenship, such as residency, so there's always been kind of restrictions, obviously, in terms of granting citizenship, which are problematic in terms of how long somebody's been resident in the country. These are being supplemented by these subjective measures around the character of an individual, the character of a subject. While the breadth of the good character requirement, and there's within the grounds of the good character, the bad character requirement, there is some evidence from some of the appeals against this measure have brought to light the ways in which cooperation with MI5 is being informally built into the decision-making process. So if you are suspected of being associated with other individuals who are deemed to be suspicious for terrorism activities, if you don't prove that you're helping to assist in changing the positions of other individuals who are deemed to be suspicious, you can be refused your citizenship on those grounds. So it supports the kind of the request of these individuals to be cooperating with the security services. But there's a bigger point as well. So it obviously affects Muslim communities and those individuals who are being criminalized around sort of terrorism and the suspicion of being a terrorism suspect. But there's also a bigger issue around asylum. Most individuals who arrive in this country via the asylum route cannot do so legitimately in legal terms because of the vast amount of legal restrictions on being able on that allow for the granting of asylum legally, right? So if you think about the amount of restrictions in the law which inhibit closer to my mouth. Okay, this is my last point. So if you think about the amount of restrictions in the law that inhibit the ability to claim asylum legally, these character requirements mean that most individuals who come to the UK via the asylum route are eligible for refusal on the grounds of bad character. And if you look at the data, and this is what we're doing as part of the project, there is a correlation between the countries the countries from which most people come who are being refused citizenship on the grounds of bad character, and the countries from where most asylum seekers arrive. So it becomes a kind of way of just enforcing or implementing a kind of tiered process of citizenship, which is also happening in terms of the way in which working class communities are being policed, the ways in which citizenship is being refused or attracted in terms of access to social welfare in various kind of ways. Okay, I think I'm told to shut up, so I'll stop there. Thanks.
So there's now going to be about 10 minutes for Q&A. Rachel, who's at the back, wave your hand, has a roaming mic. If anyone has a question, please put your hand up and she'll come to you. Or contribution. So I first want to ask Kevin, like you've grown up during the Thatcher era, and I wonder what we can learn from the Thatcher era to apply to Theresa May era.
Not sure this. Can you hear me all right with that? Yep. I touched upon this before when I mentioned, that that first Thatcher administration they were the masters of the dark arts of adversarial politics, and you can see the parallels between what's going on there and what's going on now. It wears a different suit, but it can be marked under the title of us and them. So there's a major contrick that is being perpetrated at the moment, which is actually trying to divide the what you could traditionally call, a British working class. They're trying to divide the working class into an us and them, and using this narrative of immigration as a huge stick to beat people with, and to con them to actually believe that their best interests are going to be served by a right-wing government. And that's just, I've heard that described as asking turkeys to vote for Christmas, but that is effectively the contrick that's being perpetrated, and people are just, it's like the blind leading the blind. People are walking towards it, and they have to wake up, otherwise they're going off the edge of the cliff. So in terms of, those are the parallels. It's exactly the same narrative, it's just wearing a different uniform. And we have to do something. We can't just stand by and let that happen.
I mean, it is a similar narrative, but actually it's a far more aggressive narrative, because it is speaking to working class communities as if they have one central ideology. But actually, what we know is that immigrant communities and communities of colour are affected very differently and very outside that working class discussion. So when actually our Tory government are talking about the working class, I think you're right about, sort of demonisation, but actually within that, we talk about the NHS, we talk about education, we talk about Home Office, we talk about mental health, and that affects communities of colour completely differently. But somehow it all just gets wrapped up in, working class communities. So I think that actually when we talk about that, we need to be really careful about also who is being erased from that conversation, and that's like the best way to move forward as us as kind of thinkers and activists.
Thank you. If there's any questions or contributions from the crowd, please put your hand up, and Rachel will come to you. We've actually been told we're trending on Twitter at number 14. Hashtag is DIY 2017, so please keep going so we'll make the top 10. Another question I'd just like to ask the whole panel is, apart from people making zines, what are the signs of hope?
I'll pass it down. For me, definitely the work that the Anti-Raids Network are doing in terms of informing people on the streets about immigration raids. I'm a big fan of Sisters Uncut. I'm a big fan of sort of lots of intersectional activist groups that can be found online, and you can talk to about after this discussion with me and other people. But yeah, for me, I think that those are two really strong, important things. Organisations doing very clear solution work. So yeah, I'd like to shout those guys out.
Well, I think, as I mentioned, I think a sign of hope is that the media is starting to pay attention. I think people are starting to listen through the words that the government is pitching out, and we're becoming aware that there is this us versus them sort of mentality being pitched around, but the media is increasingly starting to show those stories of the people and putting a human face on things, and they're starting to question the policies, particularly around immigration as we come into the election.
Yeah, I just wanted to say the most important thing I forgot was, after struggling with this Theresa May sculpture, I actually met Tala when he came back after being incarcerated here for 6 years and in 2 years in a Supermax prison. He was quietly brought back to the UK. I don't think he's got any apologies at all for 8 years of his life ruined, but it was such a pleasure to meet Tala after struggling with all these war of aggressions and realising that our voices get heard. I mean, Hamja did a terrific campaign and got on board a lot of people, and it helped him eventually, I'm sure, to get free. But there's so much despair going on that it's good to hear the resilience of the human spirit. Yeah.
One thing that is cause vote early days yet, but the gradual move towards decentralising government. I mean, just where I live and in Manchester, we've just elected metropolitan mayors. So the two areas have been kind of designated as city regions. So it's kind of the 5 boroughs that make up the Liverpool area. We've just elected Steve Rotherham, who was instrumental in helping change the perception of Hillsborough and to get the independent panel set up. So I mean, as of last week, he's now our kind of metropolitan mayor. So I was thinking in terms of real practical things that affect homelessness, for example. I know that he's made that an absolute priority to devote funds and resources to tackling. So I mean that as I said, it's early days, but for me that is a cause for at least cautious optimism,